In 1930, General Motors built a car engine so smooth that you could balance a coin on edge on top of it while it idled. 16 cylinders, hand-fitted, dressed up in polished aluminum and black enamel like a piece of jewelry, with the wiring hidden so not a single spark plug lead was left ugly to the eye. It cost more than most houses in America at the time. And by the company's own later admission, it never once turned a profit. Not in year 1. Not in year 11. So here's the question worth sitting with. Why did General Motors keep building an engine that lost money on every single unit for over a decade? And nearly 100 years later, why has no car company on Earth built anything like it since? This is the story of the Cadillac V16, and it's not really a story about an engine at all. It's a story about a bet placed at the top of a boom, and what happens when the world changes underneath a decision before the ink on it is even dry. Cadillac had spent the 1920s as America's standard of the world, a title it gave itself and mostly earned. But by mid-decade, the crown was slipping. Packard had a V12. Duesenberg was building supercharged straight eights that could outrun almost anything on the road. For a company whose entire identity rested on being the finest car money could buy, that was intolerable. General Motors president, Alfred Sloan, had built the whole company around a simple ladder. A car for every income, with Cadillac permanently at the top rung. If a rival brand climbed past Cadillac, the whole ladder stopped making sense. So in 1926, GM quietly earmarked funds for what internal paperwork called a multi-cylinder project, and Cadillac's general manager, Lawrence Fisher, went looking for the one man in America already working on the answer. He found him at a rival company. Owen Nacker, an engineer at Marmon, had spent years sketching a 16-cylinder engine of his own. Fisher simply hired him away. Nacker joined Cadillac in 1927, and under chief engineer Ernest Seaholm, the two of them built the engine in near-total secrecy. Official paperwork inside GM described it as a bus engine, and Fisher deliberately let rumors of a Cadillac V12 leak to the press as cover, so nobody would suspect what was actually taking shape behind closed doors. What emerged was two straight 8-cylinder blocks, cast separately, bolted onto a shared aluminum crankcase at a narrow 45-degree angle, tight enough to still fit under a normal hood. Hydraulic valve lifters silenced the mechanism almost completely. The spark plug wiring was hidden beneath a styled cover. Even the engine bay itself was treated like a showroom, polished and enameled, the first time any American manufacturer had bothered to make the inside of a car this beautiful. On January 4, 1930, Cadillac unveiled it at the New York Auto Show. A crowd of roughly 20,000 people pushed in to see it. The press called it a sensation. Nothing else on the road matched its smoothness, and at over 165 horsepower, almost nothing matched its power either. There was just one problem nobody in that crowd could see yet. For about 6 months, the V16 was everything Cadillac had hoped for. Orders poured in through the spring and summer of 1930. Every single car was custom finished. Cadillac's coach-building arm, Fleetwood, offered more than 50 distinct body styles, and buyers could specify practically anything. Town cars, 7-passenger limousines, open phaetons with a top that folded away entirely. Some versions stretched nearly 18 feet and weighed 3 tons. Prices started around $6,150 and climbed well past $8,000, at a time when a typical American family car cost under $600. Cadillac sent a fleet of the new V16S on a promotional tour across Europe that summer, rolling through Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and more than a dozen other capitals. collecting prizes and headlines the entire way. For a moment, it looked like Cadillac had done exactly what it set out to do: humiliate every rival with 16 cylinders of proof that nobody else could compete. The human cost of that proof lived on the factory floor. Building one of these engines was nothing like building a standard V8. Every crankshaft was individually balanced. Every hydraulic lifter was hand-fitted to a tolerance a standard assembly line had no way of achieving at speed. Coach builders at Fleetwood hand-shaped body panels to match a customer's specific order. One car at a time, the same way a tailor cuts a suit rather than pulling one off a rack. This wasn't mass production. It was closer to manufacturing jewelry at automotive scale. And for a brief window in 1930, Cadillac had convinced America's wealthiest buyers that this was exactly the point. By the end of that first year alone, Cadillac had sold roughly 3/4 of every V16 it would ever build across the model's entire 11-year run. Read that number again. Most of the demand for this masterpiece existed in a single 12-month window. Because 2 months before that January unveiling, the stock market had already collapsed. Here's the plain truth Cadillac's own chief engineer admitted years later. The V16 program had been approved and tooled during the last golden days of the 1920s boom, aimed squarely at what Cadillac itself called the 400 wealthiest Americans. It took roughly 3 years to go from a secret engineering project to a car in a showroom. Nobody involved in that 3-year window could have timed the Wall Street crash into their planning, because it hadn't happened yet when the bet was placed. That's decision number 1, and it's barely a mistake at all. It's just brutal timing. A flagship engine, green-lit in prosperity, arriving to meet a market that had just evaporated. But here's the decision that actually defines this story. And it's the one Cadillac made again and again, year after year, with its eyes fully open. By October of 1930, monthly production had already fallen off a cliff. Just 54 cars built that month, down from a flood of orders only months earlier. By 1931, some months saw as few as 6 or 7 cars leave the factory. And Cadillac kept building it anyway. Through the depths of the Depression, through years where production dipped to barely 50 cars annually, the company kept a hand-fitted, money-losing 16-cylinder engine in its lineup, purely because pulling it would have meant admitting Cadillac was no longer the undisputed top of the ladder. Then, in 1938, 8 full years into losing money on every single unit, Cadillac did something almost nobody expected. It didn't retire the V16. It replaced it with an entirely new one. A second-generation engine, redesigned from scratch with a wider, flatter, 135-degree layout and a simpler flathead valve design, built to be cheaper to manufacture while still delivering the same silent, turbine-smooth character the nameplate had promised since 1930. That is the real turning point of this story. Not one bad call made in a panic, but a deliberate repeated choice to keep funding a prestige weapon that everyone inside the company knew was bleeding money, because the alternative was surrendering the one thing Cadillac had built its entire identity on. The market never came back the way Cadillac needed it to. One by one, the rest of America's ultra-luxury builders, the companies Cadillac had set out to humiliate in the first place, simply stopped existing. Duesenberg closed. So did Marmon, the very company Cadillac had poached its engineer from. Auburn, Cord, Franklin, Peerless, Pierce Arrow, Stutz. Every one of them gone by the early 1940s. Even Rolls-Royce shut down its American factory in 1931. By the time the last V16 rolled off the line, Cadillac was one of only 3 American luxury nameplates still standing, alongside Packard and Lincoln. And then came the final blow that had nothing to do with engineering or economics at all. As American industry converted to war production in the early 1940s, the factory space, the skilled handfitters, the machine tools needed for something this labor-intensive were needed elsewhere. In December of 1939, the last V16 Cadillac ever built came off the line. Across 11 years, only around 4,076 had been made, an average of roughly 370 a year, and most of those in year one alone. Cadillac never brought it back. Not after the war. Not when the economy recovered. Chief engineer Ernest Seaholm retired in the early 1940s, and the company that replaced him built its next flagship engine around a completely different philosophy. An all-new, mass-producible overhead valve V8, launched in 1949, engineered for factory efficiency rather than hand craftsmanship. It delivered smoothness and power through better breathing and lighter internals, not through adding cylinders. That V8 became the template the entire American industry would follow for the next 50 years. Twice since then, Cadillac has actually tried to resurrect its own legend. A prototype effort in the 1980s. A concept car in 2003, literally named the Cadillac V16, built to court exactly the nostalgia this story is telling right now. Neither one ever reached a customer's driveway. Nobody could make the math work. Not GM in the 80s, not GM in the 2000s. So why doesn't anyone build engines like this anymore? It isn't because we lost the engineering knowledge. Modern manufacturing could machine a V16 to tolerances Owen Nacker never dreamed of. It's because the entire premise the V16 was built on has quietly disappeared. Smoothness used to be something you bought by adding cylinders, one at a time, until the vibrations cancelled themselves out. Today, an ordinary four-cylinder engine achieves that same hushed idle with computer-controlled ignition timing, balance shafts, and engine mounts that didn't exist in 1930. The problem the V16 solved with brute mechanical elegance, modern electronics solve for a fraction of the cost, the weight, and the labor. If you want more stories about the decisions that built and broke the great names in engineering, that's exactly what this channel is for. Tell me in the comments, what's the most over-engineered machine you think ever got made? And if this one pulled you in, subscribe before you go. There's more of this coming.